Good afternoon, everybody. We're pleased. Can you hear with this? It's working? We're pleased to have with us today three speakers who are going to speak on the topic of the impact on health and living conditions of the people in Fukushima Prefecture, almost to the day, 6 years after the disastrous tsunami and triple meltdown of the plants. Our first speaker, Kendra Ulrich, is a senior global energy campaigner for Greenpeace, and she is releasing a new report called Unequal Impact, which is available for you if you're there in English, on impact on particularly on the women and children. Our other speaker is Kazuko, a lawyer and Secretary General of Human Rights Now, and Noriko Matsumoto, a representative of the Support Center for Evacuees and a volunteer evacuee from. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Ms. Ulrich.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everybody for coming. First, I just want to say that it's very important to understand that disasters and catastrophes do not happen in a vacuum. These happen within the context of social and cultural constructs that have a different impact on different sectors of the society. Today, we're going to be focused specifically on the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, and therefore within the Japanese context. However, the gender inequalities that we'll be discussing today are replicated, are endemic in many societies throughout the world, and this is why women are recognized by the UN as a particularly vulnerable population in the event of a catastrophe. So many of you will know that Greenpeace has been deeply involved in radiation monitoring in the area, in the contaminated area, since just 2 weeks after the disaster began. We've returned many times to Fukushima to do, to do radiation monitoring work. In November 2016, we went back to Itate, which we've been doing significant radiation monitoring work there, and did a case study of 7 houses in Itate, wherein we were taking a look at the decontaminated area and where people would be expected to go back. Unfortunately, what we found was that people living in these houses would be exposed to up to 183 microsieverts over a 70-year lifetime, starting from this month. It's quite important to understand that the people of Itate are the most exposed population because of delayed evacuation. Those exposures don't go away. This is cumulative dose as a result of, like I said, delayed evacuation, as well as people being forced to return. In addition, only 24% of Itate has actually been decontaminated. So decontamination is extremely limited. 76% of the area is heavily contaminated mountainous forests, where homes and fields are embedded into these heavily contaminated forests, which pose a threat of recontamination of decontaminated areas for the foreseeable future. These radiation levels mean very different things for different sectors of the population. As I mentioned, we are particularly concerned with the disproportionate impact on women and children. That is not just because of the social and economic issues, but is related to the increased vulnerability of women and children to the effects of ionizing radiation. We know that not only are women and children more vulnerable, but actually female fetuses, female infants, and little girls are also more vulnerable than their male counterparts. And we know this from atomic bomb survivor epidemiological studies. We also know this from medical studies of medical exposure CT scans, which clearly demonstrate the increased risk for women, children, and girls. These should be fundamental issues that are part of the resettlement policy for the Abe government. Unfortunately, instead of addressing these issues of a uniquely vulnerable population, the Abe government is instead moving forward with an attempt to normalize the nuclear disaster. And so this idea that somehow they can clean up the radioactive contamination and that somehow people can go home and things can return to normal is really myth-making in order to minimize the impact of the nuclear disaster on the nuclear industry, not just in Japan, but also globally. And this is why we've seen, for example, the International Atomic Energy Agency and other nuclear countries deeply involved in the policy making here in Japan for the resettlement policies. What we're seeing today, which the other speakers will also talk about a bit more in depth, is deliberate economic coercion of Fukushima survivors, particularly women, in order to force people to go back to contaminated areas where they do not want to live. This not only violates their human rights, their right to environment, but also their right to health. The right to health is recognized under multiple UN treaties that Japan is party to. And an integral part of the right to health is the right to participation and the right to have information about the risks and the health effects, so full information, full transparency. Only then can people exercise their right to health and make educated choices about their health and where they will live. Unfortunately for the women of Fukushima, not only are they more vulnerable economically because of huge gender disparities in wage and in employment in Japan, as well as more vulnerable because of the physical effects of radiation, but they are also excluded from participating in meaningful ways on decision-making entities about the resettlement, about the lifting of evacuation orders, about the, and in the immediate aftermath, about the evacuation and emergency planning. Women were grossly underrepresented on these decision-making bodies, and they will continue to be unless the Abe government takes immediate action to ensure equal participation for women. Not only does the resettlement policy of the Abe government violate the human rights of women, but it also violates domestic Japanese law. In 2012, the Diet passed unanimously the Nuclear Disaster Victims Support Act. This act clearly stipulates what the Japanese government is obligated to do for nuclear survivors of the Fukushima accident. This includes the right to have full, transparent information. This includes the right to choose where they will live. This also requires the government to take a look and consider in resettlement policies the increased vulnerability of pregnant women and children, as well as provide housing support and compensation support as long as it is needed. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, none of this is being recognized by the Abe government in their policies towards Fukushima survivors. So we are calling on the Abe government to take immediate action to address some of the most egregious issues for Fukushima survivors. The most urgent of that is the extending of housing support for so-called self-evacuees, evacuees from outside the designated zones that are faced with the loss of housing support this month, at the end of this month. In addition to that, we are calling on the Abe government to assure the continuation of compensation payments a year from now for those in the areas lifted. and in addition to that, full and complete transparent information about the risks. You can find more information about our demands, there's 8 of them, in the report itself. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Ito-san with Human Rights Now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your giving me this opportunity together with wonderful colleagues. So my presentation is English, and our PowerPoint is in Japanese. So since the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened 6 years, Japanese government policy to protect human rights for the affected people are extremely insufficient at all. So we think this is a grave human rights violation. That means a violation of the right to health, right to housing, right to children's lives, and also right to environment for the affected people. So in 2011, the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened, and a huge amount of nuclear waste, materials were released, which is estimated at least 168 times that released in Hiroshima atomic bomb 1945. So that makes huge risk for the people surrounded to Fukushima on their health hazard. So as a country which is responsible for the nuclear disasters, and a country that is a party of the numerous human rights treaties, the Japanese government has obligation to protect the human rights, especially right to health, right to housing, for the people affected by this nuclear disaster. Also, the many people evacuated from Fukushima and living all over Japan, but they are recognized as IDP, internally displaced people. So government must do support for the lives for the IDP. However, our Japanese government does not recognize this kind of obligation. Especially, we would like to underscore that our Japanese government try to underestimate the magnitude of impact of this accident. Especially, they underestimate the health impact of the accident, and especially that the low-level radiations. Yes. So that's based on this policy, Japanese government take very, very extremely poor policy to the people. So before the accident, there was the national plan and national law that said that limited shared fault for the people, 1 millisievert per year. This is consistent with the international standards. But after the accident, Japanese government lifted this limitation and released it at 20 millisieverts per year. This is indeed 20 times greater than previous standards. So then after that, if the person living this criteria, that means under 20 millisieverts per year, there is no support for the evacuation. Evacuation designation is released only for the people living at the area that above the 20 millisieverts per year. So that's why there is almost no support for the people who are, decided to evacuate from outside the evacuation zone. Only support they get, only support the government provided is a free housing support. This is the only means that government provide for the people evacuated from Fukushima and designated place. So what we are really concerned is that Japanese government decided to terminate this housing support. This is only support right now in the end of March this month. So that means, because of financial problem, so that evacuated people have no choice but returning to the contaminated place. That's what we are thinking is most important and most grave. So what's happening in the area that are under 20 millisieverts per year? So there is no assistance for the people to the evacuation, and there is almost no health monitoring system, and there is no protection measures to the people affected by the radiation. So only things that has health monitoring is that for children under age 18, the thyroid cancer examination. And then last year in December, there is research results were released that made 183 children are diagnosed or doubted as a thyroid cancer. This happened after the accident. So can you imagine this kind of huge amount of 20 to 200, almost 200 children got thyroid cancer? That's a big deal. Yes, and also you may know there are a lot of bullying for the evacuated children happened in Niigata, Tokyo, and Yokohama. But government does not take any concrete measure to prevent this kind of bullying and abusing children. So this kind of situation got a lot of international concern, especially UN human rights bodies. May 2013, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, Mr. Anand Glauber, after his mission to Japan in 2012, submitted a report to the UN, a Human Rights Council, and make concrete recommendation to Japan to revise this kind of poor policy for the evacuated people. This is Mr. Anand Glauber. This is the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva that presented this report. And then one of the recommendations, you have the material, there's a handout about the Japanese and English and Japanese translation of all the recommendations made by the Mr. Anand Glauber. So Mr. Anand Glauber said most important things is that that the Japanese government must take the risk approach and take all necessary measures for the people affected by the nuclear disaster, especially most vulnerable people, most sensitive for the radiation, such as the women, especially pregnant women and children. And the evacuation order must be lifted, and should not be lifted unless the radiation risk is minimized. And evacuated people must be recommended to go back and repatriate only when the radiation level is become level under 1 millisievert per year. And until then, the Japanese government must provide all the financial support for the people so that they can freely choose whether they evacuate or voluntarily return. But this kind of recommendation have not yet achieved and implemented by the Japanese government. Also, the same kind of recommendation are made by the UN human rights body, such as Human Rights Committee, UN Human Rights Committee, and Committee of all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW Committee, last year. The both committees said the same things. Evacuee must get the financial support, and the evacuation order should not lift it unless the risk is minimized. but the Japanese government is not really implemented this kind of recommendation at all. So this is against the international human rights standard at all. So we must say this is a grave human rights violation is going on, especially when the financial support and especially housing support are terminated in Fukushima. So that's why we sent a letter to the UN and asked urgent action to stop this kind of poor policy constitutes human rights violation to the Japanese government. So I would like to hand over to my friend from Fukushima. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございます。私は東京電力、福島第一原発事故によって、当時12歳の娘を被爆から避けるために、警戒区域外の福島県郡山市から川崎に母子避難をしている松本です。
Thank you very much. My name is Noriko Matsumoto. I evacuated from Koriyama City, which was outside of the designated area, together with my daughter, who was then 12 years old, in order to avoid exposure in relation to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power accident of Tokyo Electric Power Company.
現在まで原発事故による避難指示出されていた浪江町、川俣町、飯舘村が3月の31日に避難解除、富岡町が、4月1日に解除されるということで、対象者は約3万2000人と発表されていました。で、まだまだ放射線量は高く、土壌は汚染されたまま、人が住める環境にはない。整っていない場所に放射線被曝量が年間20ミリシーベルト以下になったとして強制しています。それは今までの慰謝料、損害賠償責任まで放棄したいためだと思います。
So far, the evacuation order was issued for the town of Namie, Kawamata, and village of Iitate. But the evacuation order for those places is to be lifted on March 31st. Also, evacuation order for Tomioka town will be lifted on April 1st. According to news sources, there are 32,000 people that will be affected by these lifting of evacuation orders. These areas still have very high dosage of radiation. The land is still contaminated. It is no environment for human beings to be living, but the government says that the radiation has been reduced to less than 20 millisieverts per year. So the government is forcing people to return to these places that are really not ready for humans to live. I think they are doing this in order to avoid the responsibility, which has resulted in the payment of consolation money and compensation that they have been paying so far.
この4町村の方々も来月からは私のような警戒区域外からの避難者と同じ立場になっていきます。まだまだ放射線量が高い放射線管理区域にしなければいけないところに人々を帰還させようとする、これは犯罪だと私は思います。
The people from these 4 municipalities will be in the same position as I am, as a so-called self-evacuee from the areas outside of the designated areas. These places still have high dosage of radiation. These places should still be designated as radiation control area, but the government is forcing them to return to these places. I think this is tantamount to criminal conduct to force them to return to these places.
もう一つ問題となることがあります。それは2011年事故直後から福島県内堀知事が長崎医大の山下俊一氏という医学者を呼び、福島県民健康調査を立ち上げ、山下氏自ら検討委員会の座長となり、福島県立医大の県民健康センター長となって主導を握って 当初、福島県各地でニコニコ笑っていれば放射能は怖くないなどと講演をして回り、子どもたち、妊婦、避けられた被爆をさせたことです。
There's another issue that has to do with the Fukushima governor, Mr. Uchibori, inviting a medical scientist, Mr. Yamashita, from Nagasaki Medical University, to have him as the head of the committee to study the health investigation of the people in the Fukushima prefecture. He became the head of the Fukushima prefecture's health center, and that happened immediately after the accident. And he has been going around in different places in Fukushima prefecture and have been saying in his lectures that if you're happy and smiling and laughing, then the effects of radiation won't come to you. And by his saying so many children and pregnant women ended up being exposed to radiation, which could have been avoided.
ある新聞の取材では、毎時1015マイクロシーベルトの放射線は人間が1年間で浴びる量の半分と指摘。また10ミリシーベルト以上浴びないと人体に影響はほとんどないなどと発言しました。
In one newspaper interview, he said that 1.015 millisievert per hour is half the amount of exposure that human being will be exposed to in a year. He also said that unless you're exposed to more than 10 millisieverts, then there will be no impact on the human body.
さらに、がんを発症して原爆症認定訴訟を戦った原爆者の原爆線量が10ミリから100ミリシーベルトであると語ったと書いてありました。このように放射線被爆を医学者が過小評価をして、現在も福島県立医大の副学長として甲状腺検査専門委員会診断基準等の検討部会の座長を務め、検査の在り方を決定しています。
Further, according to this newspaper article, he went on to say that those that
決定しています。ごめんなさい。
those that had to fight litigation to have the government recognize them as people that have illness caused by atomic bomb radiation after having cancer were exposed to 10 millisievert to 100 millisieverts. So as a medical scientist, he greatly underestimated the effects of radiation, and still to this day, he is serving as the head of the committee to look into the ways to look into the criteria to diagnose the health checkup or health inspection regarding thyroid cancer as the vice president of Fukushima Medical University, and he is the one that is deciding how people should be screened or tested to see if people have thyroid cancer or not.
このように被爆を過小評価、東京電力福島原発の事故の責任を認めず、被爆を避けるために避難を余儀なくされた警戒区域外の避難者も、強制的に避難を余儀なくされた警戒区域内の避難者も4月から自己責任とされ、国内難民となり、国策として進めてきたこの原子力事故の責任を国は果たしていません。まだ原子力緊急事態宣言は発令されたまま、私たちは見捨てられています。
So this way they are undermining or underestimating the effects of exposure to radiation. They are not taking the responsibility for the nuclear power plant accident of Tokyo Electric Power Company. And those that have evacuated from outside the designated area and those that were forced to evacuate from inside the designated areas will completely be on their own. They will have to fend for themselves, and they will be internally displaced people starting in April. the government has not taken any responsibility for the accident that was caused as a result of the state policy. So, and the state of nuclear emergency declaration has still been issued, and we are being abandoned by the government.
ぜひ皆さんに考えていただきたいと思います。ありがとうございました。
I hope that you will think about this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies. Can we have questions now from the floor? Starting with the working press. Yes, sir.
Ulrich?
Ulrich.
Ulrich. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to ask a question to Ms. Ulrich. I have a totally different view. I think evacuation itself is against the human right, because people were forced to evacuate from the designated area, and actually about 2,500 people died in a couple of months. They were killed because of the evacuation. My understanding is that I'm a generous member of the Scientists for Accurate Radiation Information. I'm a freelance journalist with Yukon Fuji. But if, for example, if the 100 millisievert is safe, the understanding of the situation is totally different. People should be freely returned to the place that they used to live. And then the place, the evacuated area, didn't have to be like a ghost town. It's terrible. So what would you? Okay, so my question is, how would you argue with this kind of argumentation?
Sure. So there are several points that you raised there, and I think the first and foremost is that the internationally accepted model for radiation risk is the no linear threshold model. This means that the international consensus is of the scientific community and the radio protection community is that, exactly, the LNT model, is that there is no level below which they can say that there is no health effect from radiation exposure. So the idea that somehow 100 millisieverts is safe is simply not supported by the international LNT model, which is, again, the internationally accepted model by the ICRP, as well as by the IAEA and nuclear scientists the world over. Yes, so in that as well, in addition to that, in the event of a nuclear catastrophe, it is incumbent upon the government, because of the risks of radiation. There is no debate in the scientific community that radiation, ionizing radiation, is a mutagen and a carcinogen. It causes cancer. It causes cardiovascular disease. It causes numerous other health effects, including birth defects, perinatal mortality, etc. These are known issues, so there's no debate about that. In addition to that, again, here, if we can put this back up. So this slide just talks about some of the studies that show significantly increased risk for women and children. So an adult male is much less vulnerable than a little girl or an infant or a female fetus. Again, this is from epidemiological studies of atomic bomb survivors. This is from medical exposures. CT scans showing significant increased risk for children that are exposed to radiation, CT scans, etc., in their childhood for developing cancers. However, for example, for coronary angiography, CT scans, a study was done for women at the age of 40 that received this. 1 in 270 developed cancer as a result of this medical exposure, whereas for men it was 1 in 600. For children, that was significantly increased, and for younger women at 20 years old, the risk doubled from what I just mentioned. So again, this is not a debate about whether or not 100 millisieverts is safe. The reason why the ICRP recommends keeping radiation exposures as low as reasonably achievable is because ionizing radiation is a carcinogen and does cause multiple other health issues. And again, it's very difficult to pinpoint one person's cancer with one environmental pollutant. And so that is why they do epidemiological studies in order to be able to determine what the increased risks are, the excessive risk ratios. And we know that radiation exposure causes this. So yes, in the immediate aftermath, and quite frankly, the issues with the evacuation, with emergency planning, were known issues, which highlights the fundamental crux of the nuclear industry here in Japan, but also the world over, which is that evacuation from a nuclear disaster is a myth. That we can safely protect people from radiation exposure is something that is a fabrication of the nuclear industry to justify its continuation. UN Council had already raised these issues about nuclear evacuation, about emergency planning, and about Japan's lack of transparency for nuclear safety issues in 2001, a decade before the Fukushima disaster happened. These were not addressed. And so the human rights violations that resulted from the evacuation, as well as the complete lack of representation for women, were a decade-long history of policy failure on the part of the Japanese government. And unfortunately, they have continued to persist in that same venue, in that same avenue of complete lack of inclusion of vulnerable groups, lack of transparency. And as I said before, this is a coercive mechanism to move people towards resettling in contaminated areas. We're not saying that people should be forced to stay away or forced to leave in this moment. What we are saying is that people have the right to choose. And by the right to choose, it means that people have to be given full, complete, accurate information about the risks, including what the international scientific community agrees to. They should be given full compensation, whether they choose to return or whether they choose to leave. And by full compensation for those who return, they should be compensated for their loss of community, and they should be compensated for the extra health risks that they are taking by living in these contaminated environments.
Let's see if there's any more questions here. Next question, please. I see the gentleman in the back first, and then this gentleman here.
This question is from Ms. Daniel Hurst, a freelance journalist. My question is for Matsumoto-san. Can I ask you, when the housing support finishes this month, what exactly do you plan to do? How will you respond to that? And secondly, of the other so-called self-evacuees who you've been talking to, how do they plan to respond to this? What's the personal impact of this decision? Thank you.
Who do you want to answer that question?
私のことを言えば、私は神奈川県の民間借り上げを借りているので、やはり郡山の自宅には除染をしたものがありますので帰ることができません。なので今の住宅に継続して住み続ける、お金を払って住み続けるということです。でもう一つのその質問ですけど、3月で打ち切りになると私たちのようなほとんど母子避難、子どもを被爆から避けるために避難したお母さんたちが7割を占めています。そのお母さんたちはやはり2割は戻るしかないという方もいらっしゃいます。でもやはりまだ戻れないという方がほとんどなんですね。その方のために私たち避難者も支援をしてくださる方も どういうふうにしてこの住宅の確保を継続しなければいけないかということで、行政側と今いろんな方たちと協力して今後その住宅を奪われないような対策を考えています。
As for myself, I am currently living in the housing that was made available in the civil sector in Kanagawa Prefecture. I have my home in Koriyama City, but that has gone through decontamination, so I cannot return to my home in Koriyama. So in my case, I will start paying for my current housing out of my own pocket, and I will continue to live in the place that I am currently living in. As for your other question regarding what other people are planning to do after March, most of the people that are evacuating will be in a will have to make a decision. About 70% of the evacuees that are evacuating, mother and their children, are evacuating because they want to avoid having their children being exposed to radiation. And among those, about 20% are saying that they have nothing else, they have no other way but to return. But most people are saying that they are unable to, or they do not want to return to where they used to live. So in order to support those that are saying that they cannot return, we are trying to make sure that there is a way to secure housing for those people that do not want to return. So among ourselves, evacuees, and those that support us, we are currently trying to negotiate and work something out with the local administrations and try to get their support and coordination so that we can continue to secure housing going forward and make sure that nobody will be deprived of the housing that they're currently living in.
Justin McCurry from The Guardian. This is for Matsumoto-san as well. Could I just check, are there any circumstances under which you would return to your home in Koriyama? I couldn't catch whether you said it had or had not been decontaminated properly. And just as a follow-up question, what sort of impact has the last 5-6 years of being an evacuee had on your family? Perhaps it's also had an impact on your health. Obviously don't want you to discuss private matters, but if you can share something about that, it'd be very helpful. Thank you.
除染されたのは、家だけですね。なので、都会とは違って、福島は森林があります、公園もあります。そういうところは除染をされていません。で、自宅にやはり、警戒区域外の家ですが除染物があります。そこに、確かに今は空間線量は下がりましたが、地表面は同じく汚染されています。そこにやはり戻れない。しかし、福井地が完全にもう収束されているならば、また考え方は変わると思います。で、私はやはり今まで、医学的放射線被曝っていうことで、必ず放射線は X 線にしてもそうですが、リスクがあるんだと教わってきました。なので、少なければいいかという問題ではないと思っています。ですから、この原発事故が収束しない限り、子どもたちは、危険なところには返せないと私自身は思っています。 はい。
So what was decontaminated was just my house. Unlike in the urban areas, Fukushima has lots of forest, Fukushima has lots of parks, and these places are not decontaminated. So if I were to go back to my home, I would have to live in an environment where there are lots of items that were sort of dug up as a result of decontamination effort. I would be surrounded by such so-called decontaminated items. The dosage for the space around has come down, but the surface of the ground is still the same. It is still contaminated, so I cannot return to my home. I might change my mind if Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant has come completely to a closure or to some kind of an end completely. I was taught that even with the medical radiation exposure like X-ray, there will be a risk. So it's not a matter of smaller the exposure to radiation, better it is, or as long as it's little amount, it should be fine. I don't think that's the issue. So unless this disaster comes to a closure or some kind of a complete end, I cannot bring my children back to a place that is still dangerous.
この6年間ですね、私は、きちっとした情報を得れれば被爆させずに済んだ娘を被爆させてしまった。鼻血を出して、体調を崩した娘をやはり初期被爆と私は思い、今6年を迎えます。で、娘はやはり当時12歳の娘はなぜ避難をしなければいけなかったか、自宅があるにもかかわらず主人がいる、友達もいるところから避難をしなくちゃいけなかったかということは、当時の12歳の娘は自分のために被爆をこれ以上させたくないという私の気持ちを分かって今も一緒に避難をし続けています。なので、この原発事故が必ず加害者がいるにもかかわらず、私たちが自己責任にされるということに関してこの6年間本当に辛い思いをしてこの6年間を過ごしています。
So looking back on the past 6 years, I always have this sense that I ended up subjecting my daughter to unnecessary exposure. Had I had proper information, my daughter bled from her nose, her health was impacted negatively. I believe that was the phenomena, or that was the symptoms of initial exposure. So it's been 6 years since then. My daughter was then 12 years old. And she had to evacuate from where we lived, where we evacuated from the place where we had our home, where we had my husband, her friends, but she understood my thoughts and feelings about how I felt that it was necessary for my daughter not to expose her to any more radiation. So she is still with me, she is still evacuating with me. This nuclear power plant accident has a perpetrator, but somehow it was turned into a situation where we were somehow responsible for this. So it's been very tough 6 years for us.
We're getting close to our hour here. Is there any more questions, including those from the non-working press? I see none. In that case, I'll say bring this meeting to a close, and with thanks to our guest speakers.
Great. Thank you so much. Yep. Thank you for having us. Thank you for coming.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.